The Conjuring Farmhouse, 9 Years of Terror. The real-life Perron family farmhouse siege. Introduction: The anatomy of a siege. Most horror stories are told in snapshots. A sudden bump in the night, a fleeting apparition in a mirror, a brief summer of terror that ends when the moving truck arrives. We comfort ourselves with the illusion of geography, the belief that terror is a place, and that if we simply pack our belongings and flee, the nightmare stays behind, locked in the dark wood of an old house. But true horror is rarely a sprint. It is a marathon of psychological attrition. It is a slow, methodical wear and tear on the human spirit, an invisible pressure that builds so gradually over weeks, months, and years that the victims don't realize they are drowning until the water has already filled their lungs. This is the true chronicle of the old Arnold estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island. It is not the story of a movie. It is the unembellished account of a 9-year occupation. A family trapped by poverty, isolated by geography, and held hostage by a shifting ecosystem of the dead. For nearly a decade, 7 human souls shared 10 rooms with an army of shadows, anchored by a central, malignant intelligence that did not merely want to scare them. It wanted to consume them. Turn the volume down slightly, settle into the dark. This is the complete, uncut history of the Harrisville siege. Chapter 1: The Promise of 1736. The story does not begin with a ghost. It begins with an old-fashioned American dream that was simply running out of room. By the winter of 1970, Roger and Carolyn Perron were drowning in the chaotic, cramped reality of raising 5 young daughters in a small suburban environment. Andrea, the eldest, was a sharp, observant girl who acted as a second mother to her sisters. Below her were Nancy, fierce and fiercely independent; Christine, a quiet, sensitive soul; Cindy, vibrant and energetic; and little April, the baby of the family, a child who still saw the world through a lens of absolute innocence. Roger Perron was a traveling salesman, a man who worked himself to the bone driving across the highways of New England, trying to provide a stable life for his women. Carolyn was the emotional anchor of the home, warm, deeply affectionate, and fiercely protective of her girls. But 5 daughters need space to run. They need fields, trees, and a house where their voices don't bounce off the walls of a crowded neighborhood. For months, Carolyn pored over local real estate guides until she found a listing that seemed too good to be true. Deep in the rural, heavily wooded heart of Rhode Island, nestled in the small township of Harrisville, lay the old Arnold estate. The property was a breathtaking relic of early American history. It spanned 200 sprawling acres of rolling hills, ancient pine forests, and crumbling stone fences that had been laid by hand 2 centuries prior. At the center of this vast tract of land sat a monumental colonial-era farmhouse, its foundation laid in 1736. The house boasted 10 grand, low-ceilinged rooms, 8 massive brick fireplaces, a cavernous barn, and a deep, stone-lined well that drew water from the dark aquifers beneath the property. To Roger and Carolyn, it felt like an oasis. The price was staggeringly low, so low that a modest traveling salesman could afford the mortgage without bankrupting his family. The seller seemed eager, almost desperate, to close the deal, dismissing the low price as the result of the house needing cosmetic updating and its deep isolation from modern amenities. On a biting, clear day in January 1971, the parents signed the deed. They packed every worldly possession they owned into a rented moving truck and drove toward the countryside. The air was crisp, the snow crunched beneath the tires, and the girls pressed their faces against the glass, watching the suburban concrete give way to the dense, dark, interlocking branches of the Rhode Island woods. They believed they were driving toward their future. They had no idea they were driving straight into the unhealed wounds of the past. Chapter 2: The Warning on the Threshold. The moving truck rumbled up the long, unpaved dirt driveway of the estate, kicking up gravel and dust against the snowbank. The farmhouse stood before them, a towering, weathered structure of dark timber and graying clapboard, its multi-paned windows reflecting the pale winter sun like cold, dead eyes. Despite its age, the house had a majestic, heavy presence. It looked like it had grown straight out of the earth itself. As the Perron family piled out of their station wagon, the previous owner was finishing up packing his own vehicle. He was an elderly man, his face lined with a weariness that didn't seem to match his age. He watched the 5 young girls spill out onto the frozen grass, laughing and chasing each other toward the massive red barn. Roger walked over to shake the man's hand and received the keys, heavy black iron instruments that felt cold even through leather gloves. The man exchanged polite pleasantries with Roger, but his eyes kept drifting toward Carolyn, who was holding little April's hand, looking up at the front door with an expression of pure hope. The man's demeanor suddenly shifted. The polite mask fell away, replaced by an unsettling, rigid gravity. He leaned in close to Roger, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that barely carried over the winter wind. "For the sake of your family," the old man said, his eyes drilling into Roger's, "leave the lights on at night. Never turn them off." Roger blinked, momentarily taken aback. He forced a polite chuckle, assuming the previous owner was merely warning him about the home's ancient, outdated knob-and-tube electrical wiring, or perhaps the complete, oppressive darkness that swallows the rural countryside when there are no streetlights for miles. "Sure thing, regular maintenance," Roger replied, offering a reassuring smile. But the old man didn't smile back. He didn't offer a word of congratulations. He simply turned, climbed into his car, and drove down the long dirt driveway, his tail lights disappearing into the dark corridor of the pine trees. He left the Perron family standing on the threshold of their new life, holding the keys to a house that had just received its first warning. The family ignored the chill of the moment and threw open the heavy front door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and centuries of dust. The girls ran through the rooms, their footsteps booming against the wide plank orange pine floors. The house felt like a labyrinth of history. There were secret closets, small staircases that led to dead ends, and a cavernous cellar with a dirt floor and low-hanging stone arches that felt cold even with the heating running. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows of branches across the living room walls, the initial excitement slowly gave way to a strange, heavy quiet. By nightfall, the house was entirely surrounded by an absolute, suffocating darkness. Remembering the old man's words, Carolyn went from room to room, flicking on every light switch. The dim, yellow bulbs did little to pierce the dense, ancient shadows that seemed to pool in the corners of the 200-year-old rooms. That night, tucked into their makeshift beds on the floor, the girls slept fitfully, listening to the house moan and creak against the winter wind. It was the sound of a house adjusting to the warmth of new lives, or perhaps the sound of an ancient domain realizing it was no longer alone. Chapter 3: The Routine of Anomalies. By the time the spring thaw arrived in March 1971, the Perron family had settled into the rhythm of rural life. Roger was back on the road for days at a time, leaving Carolyn to manage the massive house and the 5 girls. It was during these periods of isolation that the house began to introduce its true nature, not with violent terrors, but with small, maddening distortions of the mundane. Carolyn was a woman who prided herself on structure and cleanliness. She established a strict routine for chores to keep the massive farmhouse in order, but the house seemed to resist her efforts. It began with the simple act of sweeping the kitchen floor. On a Tuesday morning, Carolyn carefully swept the wide pine planks of the kitchen, gathering the dust, pet hair, and debris into a neat, compact pile in the center of the room. She turned her back for no more than 30 seconds to retrieve the dustpan from the pantry down the hall. When she returned, she froze. The dirt pile was gone. It hadn't been swept away. It had been meticulously and evenly scattered back across the entire perimeter of the kitchen floor, as if a gentle, deliberate breeze had blown through the closed room. There were no open windows, no drafts. And her daughters were all outside playing in the yard. Carolyn shook her head, blaming her own exhaustion, and swept it again. The next day, it happened again, and the day after that. Then came the atmospheric shifts. The farmhouse began to project conflicting sensory experiences. Periodically, without any logical origin, the sweet, heavy, cloying scent of fresh lilacs would drift through the living room. It was a beautiful smell, so intense it felt as though someone had placed a massive bouquet right beneath Carolyn's nose. It would linger for a few minutes, and then vanish instantly. But the alternative was unbearable. Occasionally, a sudden, overpowering stench of rotting flesh would fill a specific corner of a hallway or bedroom. It was a smell so foul, so thick with the aroma of decay, that it made the girls gag and cover their faces with their shirts. Roger searched the floorboards, the walls, and the cellar, convinced that a family of mice or a raccoon had crawled behind the plaster and died. But he found nothing. The smell would exist in a perfect, localized pocket of air for 10 minutes, completely unmoving, and then evaporate into nothingness, leaving the air clean and sweet once more. Roger, ever the pragmatist, refused to entertain any supernatural explanations. "It's a 200-year-old house, Carolyn," he would say, sitting at the kitchen table after a long week of driving. "The wood breathes, the plaster shifts, the plumbing is ancient. Houses this old make noises and trap smells. Don't let the isolation get to your head." But Roger wasn't there during the quiet hours of the afternoon. He wasn't there when the objects began to move. Carolyn would place her car keys on the kitchen counter, walk into the dining room to fold laundry, and return to find the keys sitting on the third step of the central staircase. Scissors would vanish from drawers, only to reappear days later, sitting perfectly in the center of an empty dining table. The family was being watched, tested, and catalogued by an unseen intelligence that was slowly figuring out the boundaries of their patience. Chapter 4: The Microcosm of the Sisters. To understand the true depth of the Harrisville haunting, one must understand that it did not affect the Perron family as a single, uniform entity. The house was an ecosystem of spirits, and like any ecosystem, it sought out different relationships with different inhabitants. The 5 sisters, ranging from teenagers to a toddler, experienced the farmhouse through 5 entirely distinct lenses of reality. Andrea, the eldest, felt the psychological weight of the house most acutely. Because she was old enough to understand the strain her parents were under, she tried to internalize her fear. But the central staircase became her personal gauntlet. Whenever she walked up to the second floor, the air would thicken. It felt as though she were walking through water, her chest tightening, her heart hammering against her ribs. She describes the sensation as a feeling of intense, uninterrupted hatred burning into the back of her neck. She learned to never walk up those stairs without her eyes fixed firmly on her feet, refusing to look at the landing above, where the shadows always seemed a shade darker than they should be. Nancy and Christine shared a bedroom on the second floor, and their experience was defined by a creeping sense of vulnerability. They were the ones who first noticed the bedsheets. In the quiet hours before dawn, they would wake up to a slow, firm, rhythmic tugging at the base of their beds. It wasn't a sudden jerk. It felt as if someone was carefully and systematically unfolding the blankets and pulling them down toward the floorboards. One night, Christine woke up to the sensation of the cold air hitting her ankles. She sat up, thinking Nancy was playing a prank. In the dim light filtering through the window, she saw the heavy quilt slowly sliding off the mattress. She grabbed the edge of the blanket, pulling it back up with a frustrated grunt. "Nancy, stop it," she muttered. From across the room, Nancy's voice came back, trembling and wide awake from her own bed. "Christine, I'm over here. I'm not touching your bed." Christine froze. She looked down at the foot of her bed. The blanket was yanked down with a sudden, violent, inhuman force. Christine was pulled forward, her body sliding down the mattress until her feet hit the floorboards with a dull thud, the blankets disappearing entirely into the darkness beneath her bed. Cindy, the 4th daughter, experienced a more direct, visual manifestation of the house's historical residents. She was a child of high energy, but the house began to drain her. One afternoon, while playing quietly with her dolls in her bedroom, she looked up to see a man standing near her closet. He wore a heavy wool coat and dirt-stained trousers from a different century. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and deep-set, radiating a profound, crushing sadness. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood there, an uninvited guest from 1850, watching a little girl play in 1971. Cindy didn't scream. The spirit's sadness was so overwhelming that she felt a wave of pity wash over her. She watched him until the sunlight shifted and he dissolved into the dust motes. But it was little April, the youngest, who formed the most bizarre and heartbreaking relationship with the unseen. April began spending hours alone in the downstairs parlor, talking to someone who wasn't there. When Carolyn asked her who she was speaking to, April looked up with wide, innocent eyes and said, "His name is Oliver. He's a little boy, and he's very sad. He likes my toys." April claimed that Oliver would sit on the rug across from her. She would roll a small wooden marble toward the empty corner, and after a moment of silence, the marble would slowly, steadily roll back across the level floorboards, stopping perfectly at April's feet. To a child, it was a game. To Carolyn, watching from the doorway, it was a terrifying confirmation. The dead were playing with her baby. Chapter 5: The Patrol of the Manny. As the summer of 1971 bled into autumn, the family came to realize that the house was crowded. There wasn't just one entity, there were generations of spirits trapped within the property's historical boundaries, creating a strange, paranormal hierarchy. And among these spirits, some seemed to take on roles of protection. The girls began to notice a recurring phenomenon every night precisely at 10:00 p.m. After the lights were extinguished and the house settled into its nocturnal chill, a sound would begin in the downstairs hallway. It was the distinct, heavy, rhythmic thud of work boots stepping onto the hardwood planks. Thud, thud, thud. The footsteps would move slowly from the kitchen, down the long central corridor, and pause at the base of the staircase. Then, the sound would ascend the stairs, the old wood groaning under a weight that wasn't there. The girls nicknamed this entity the Manny. They believed he was the spirit of a long-dead farmhand or caretaker who had loved the land in life and could not abandon his duties in death. The Manny would walk the upper hallway, his footsteps pausing outside each of the sisters' bedrooms. The door latches would occasionally click, or a door would gently push open an inch, as if someone were checking on a sleeping child. Andrea recalled that during the most terrifying nights, when the darker forces in the house were active, the sound of the Manny's footsteps brought an odd sense of comfort. "We knew he was there," she later wrote. "He was pulling guard duty. He was the buffer between us and the things that lived deeper in the dark." Along with the Manny, there was the sweeper. Carolyn would frequently sit in the living room and hear the unmistakable rustle of a straw broom sliding against the kitchen floorboards. It was a rhythmic, peaceful sound, shhhk, shhhk, shhhk. Upon entering the kitchen, the sound would cease instantly. The room would be empty, but Carolyn would find her broom resting against an entirely different wall than where she had left it, or the kitchen chairs would be perfectly and neatly tucked beneath the table, far tighter than the children ever left them. For a brief, naive period, the Perrons believed they could manage this reality. They adopted a policy of extreme compartmentalization. If a door slammed on its own, they ignored it. If a glass slid across the dining table, Roger would calmly reach out, catch it before it hit the floor, and continue his conversation. They told themselves that as long as the spirits were harmless echoes of history, sad men, cleaning women, and little boys playing with marbles, they could endure the strangeness for the sake of the beautiful land and the affordable mortgage. But they were only seeing the surface. They were looking at the peaceful spirits who were themselves victims of the house. Deeper down, buried in the blood-soaked soil of the estate's dark genealogy, lay an entity that did not want to clean, did not want to protect, and did not want to play. It was an entity born of malice, cruelty, and an ancient hatred for the living, and it was finally ready to introduce itself. Chapter 6: The Bloodline of the Arnold Estate. To understand the violence that was about to unfold, one must look at the historical ledger that Ede and Lorraine Warren would later uncover in the local registries of Harrysville. The old Arnold estate was not just an old house. It was a monument to multi-generational human tragedy. For over 2 centuries, a single family line, the Arnolds, had occupied the land, and a curse of unnatural death seemed to follow the bloodline like a plague. The historical records revealed a sickening pattern of suicide, murder, and sudden madness attached to the property. In the late 18th century, John Arnold, a wealthy patriarch of the family line, walked into the massive timber barn on a cold morning, tied a heavy hemp rope over one of the structural rafter beams, kicked away a wooden barrel, and hanged himself. His body swung in the dark for days before he was discovered. Decades later, another family member, a young woman named Prudence Arnold, was brutally murdered on the property, her life taken by a farmhand in a fit of sudden, unexplainable violence. Two other previous inhabitants had committed suicide within the walls of the farmhouse itself, both choosing to end their lives by drinking lethal doses of poison in the master bedroom, their agonizing final moments absorbed by the very wood planks beneath Roger and Carolyn's bed. Another young child drowned in the stone-lined well in the yard, her small lungs filling with the icy water that the Perrons now used for their daily life. The land was saturated with the energy of sudden, violent departures. Every corner of the house had a historical stain, but the name that carried the heaviest weight of terror, the name that the old townspeople spoke of only in hushed whispers over drinks at the local tavern, was Bathsheba Sherman. Bathsheba had lived on the homestead in the mid-19th century, marrying into the property's lineage. According to local law and church archives, she was a woman of immense cruelty and darkness. In 1844, an infant died mysteriously while under her direct care. The town was small, and suspicions ran high. When the coroner examined the child's tiny body, he discovered a horrific, stomach-turning truth. A long, thin, iron-sewing needle had been deliberately and cleanly driven through the base of the baby's skull, piercing its brain. The community openly accused Bathsheba of practicing the dark arts, branding her a witch who had sacrificed the innocent child to Satan in exchange for eternal connection to the land. Though she was legally acquitted due to a lack of concrete physical evidence, she became a social pariah, a monster living in plain sight. Local legends stated that she treated her servants with savage brutality, starving them and beating them in the cellars. When Bathsheba finally died an old, bitter woman in 1885, the local doctor noted a phenomenon that passed into town mythology. He claimed that upon her death, her physical body hardened with an unnatural, terrifying speed, her flesh turning to a cold, grotesque, stone-like substance before she could even be placed in her grave. Bathsheba had died, but her spirit had refused to leave the soil she had bought with blood. She had spent nearly a century dominating every other ghost on the property, creating a dark kingdom of fear. And now, a new mother had moved into her house. A warm, loving woman who dared to raise 5 beautiful children in Bathsheba's domain. To Bathsheba, Carolyn Perron was not a tenant, she was an insult. Chapter 7: The Mark of the Needle. The shift from ambient haunting to targeted physical warfare happened with a terrifying suddenness in the winter of 1972. Bathsheba Sherman had finished observing her prey, and she chose Carolyn Perron as her primary target. It began with the physical degeneration of Carolyn. She began waking up in the morning feeling entirely drained, her muscles aching as if she had run a marathon in her sleep. When she stood before the bathroom mirror, she began discovering deep, painful bruises mapping her flesh, mottled purple and black marks that wrapped around her upper arms, her calves, and her torso. They weren't the scattered marks of an accidental bump against furniture. They were distinct, finger-shaped imprints, as if large, powerful hands had gripped her with immense force and tried to drag her. One afternoon, Carolyn was standing at the kitchen sink, washing the lunch dishes while the girls were in the living room. The house was quiet. Suddenly, a sharp, white-hot, agonizing pain shot through her right calf. It was so intense she gasped, dropping a ceramic plate, which shattered into the sink. She clutched her leg, stumbling backward against the counter. She pulled back the fabric of her skirt. There in the center of her calf was a small, perfectly circular puncture wound. It was fresh, bleeding slightly and burning as if she had been branded. It looked exactly like the mark left behind by a heavy iron sewing needle. There were no insects in the clean kitchen, no sharp objects near her legs. The house had stabbed her. That night, the entity chose to reveal its face. Carolyn woke up in the dead of night to an absolute freezing chill. The heating system was hummed in the background, but the air in the master bedroom was so cold that her breath turned to thick, white plumes of mist. Beside her, Roger was snoring deeply, locked in the heavy sleep of physical exhaustion. Carolyn turned her head toward the foot of the bed. There, standing in the dense shadows, was the manifestation of Bathsheba Sherman. The apparition was a vision of pure, unadulterated nightmare. It was the figure of a tall woman, her head tilted at a horrific, sickening 90-degree angle, as if her neck had been violently snapped. Her face was a landscape of decayed, graying flesh, the skin pulled taut over her skull like parchment. Her eye sockets were hollow black pools, but deep within them, a faint, malevolent light seemed to burn. Her mouth was frozen in a jagged, cruel sneer, revealing yellowed teeth. She wore a filthy, tattered grey dress, the fabric stiff with grease and dried earth, smelling of sulphur and wet grave. Carolyn tried to scream, but her throat went completely dry, her vocal cords paralyzed by fear. The entity didn't speak aloud. Instead, a voice materialized directly inside Carolyn's mind, a voice that was raspy, ancient, and dripping with pure, venomous hatred. "Get out," the voice hissed, vibrating against Carolyn's skull. "Get out of my house. I will drive you into the earth. I will have your children." The apparition lingered for 10 agonizing seconds, the stench of decay filling the room, before slowly dissolving backward into the darkness of the closet. Carolyn lay awake for the rest of the night, clutching the blankets to her chest, listening to her husband's steady breathing, realizing with absolute certainty that she was locked in a life-or-death struggle for her home and her daughters. Chapter 8: The Siege of the Daughters. Once Bathsheba had crossed the line into physical violence, the rest of the house seemed to follow her lead. The benevolent spirits went entirely silent, driven into the deep corners of the property by the dominant malice of the witch. The farmhouse became a gauntlet of terror for the 5 sisters. The entities began targeting the children's rooms with a coordinated fury. One evening, around 9:00 p.m., Cindy ran screaming into Andrea's bedroom, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. She claimed that while she was lying in her bed, the mattress had begun to shake. Andrea, trying to be the brave older sister, walked back to Cindy's room, holding her hand. "It's just the wind against the side of the house, Cindy," she said, trying to steady her own voice. But before they could step across the threshold, both girls froze. Cindy's heavy wooden-framed bed began to lift. It didn't shake. It rose smoothly and violently several inches off the hardwood floorboards, hovering in the air for a terrifying, physics-defying second. Then, the unseen force released its grip, and the bed slammed back down to the floor with a deafening crash that shook the walls and cracked the pine frame. On another night, Nancy and Christine were awakened by the sound of their closet door violently rattling against its latch, as if someone were trapped inside and trying to claw their way out. As they sat up in terror, the air in their room plummeted to freezing. Suddenly, the heavy blankets on their bed were firmly and violently gripped at the foot of the mattress. Christine tried to fight back, lunging forward to grab the edge of the quilt, pulling it back up to her chin with all her strength. But she was no match for the inhuman power that held the other side. The entity yanked the blankets with such immense force that Christine was pulled straight off the mattress, her body flying through the air before her head struck the hard pine floorboards with a sickening thud. She lay there crying in the dark as the blankets were dragged under the closet door, disappearing into the wall. Roger Perron was unraveling. His traveling schedule had become a psychological torture. Every time he pulled his station wagon out of the driveway for a 3-day sales trip, his chest tightened with an agonizing guilt. He knew he was leaving his wife and daughters defenseless against an enemy he couldn't comprehend. He began staying up all night when he was home. He would sit at the kitchen table in the pitch black, a loaded 12-gauge shotgun resting across his lap, his eyes strained, staring into the dark corridor of the hallway. He would listen to the scratching in the walls, the phantom footsteps on the stairs, and the low, mocking whispers that seemed to drift through the keyholes. He was a man trained to protect his family from physical threats, burglars, wild animals, fires. But how do you shoot a shadow? How do you protect your daughters from a woman who died in 1885? The financial trap was absolute. The energy crisis of the early 1970s had hit the country hard, and Roger's sales commissions were dwindling. Every dime they possessed, every scrap of equity they had built in their lives, was sunk into the 200 acres of the Harrisville estate. They couldn't afford to walk away and rent an apartment. They couldn't find a single buyer willing to purchase a house that was quickly becoming a notorious legend among the local townspeople. They were completely isolated, held hostage by their own poverty and a spirit that grew stronger with every ounce of fear they fed it. Chapter 9. The Arrival of the Demonologists. By the late months of 1973, the Perron family was broken. Carolyn had lost significant weight, her skin gray, her eyes surrounded by deep, dark circles. The girls were failing in school, terrorized by sleep deprivation and the constant, oppressive atmosphere of their home. Desperate for a savior, Carolyn reached out to a local paranormal research group, who in turn contacted Ede and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were rapidly becoming the most famous and controversial paranormal investigators in the United States. Based out of Bridgeport, Connecticut, they operated the New England Society for Psychic Research. Ede was a self-taught demonologist, a former police officer who approached cases with a methodical, theological framework. Lorraine was a professed clairvoyant and light trance medium, a woman who claimed she could see the spiritual architecture of a haunting the way an architect sees a blueprint. On a bleak afternoon in early 1974, the Warrens' car pulled up the long dirt driveway of the old Arnold estate. The sun was setting, casting a bloody, deep red hue across the clapboards of the farmhouse. Lorraine Warren stepped out of the vehicle, took 3 steps toward the front porch, and suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. Her hand flew to her throat, her chest heaving as if she was suffocating. She closed her eyes, her face turning an ash-gray color. Ede rushed to her side, holding her arm. "Lorraine, what is it?" When she opened her eyes, they were filled with a profound dread. She looked up at the darkened windows of the second floor and whispered, "The moment I stepped onto this land, I was hit by a wave of pure, concentrated malice. The feeling of evil here is instantaneous. It's a malignancy that has been growing for over a century." Inside, the family was waiting. Ede Warren immediately began setting up his equipment on the kitchen table: heavy, reel-to-reel tape recorders, high-frequency microphones, and thermal cameras. The black magnetic tape began to spin slowly, capturing the low, rhythmic, internal hum of the 200-year-old house. Ede sat across from Carolyn and Roger, his expression grave. "Tell us everything," he said, "from the very first hour you stepped through that door." For 4 hours, the Perrons poured out their 3 years of torment. They spoke of the dirt piles, the smells of decay, the bruises, the needle punctures, and the terrifying, broken-necked figure of Bathsheba. While they spoke, Lorraine Warren sat in the corner of the room, her eyes tracking something invisible near the ceiling. To her psychic vision, the room was crowded. She could see the sad, pale faces of the Arnold family victims huddled in the corners, weeping, completely dominated and held hostage by a massive, swirling vortex of pitch-black, negative energy that hovered directly above Carolyn's head. Lorraine leaned forward, interrupting her husband. She looked at Carolyn and said, "This entity doesn't want to scare you, dear. It is systematically stripping away your willpower. It is draining your life force because it is preparing for something far worse than a haunting." Ede Warren nodded, his voice dropping an octave. "You are in the second stage of a demonic invasion. First comes infestation, the noises and the tricks. You are now in oppression. The spirit is crushing your mind and your body, and they only do that for one reason: they are clearing out your soul to make room for possession." Chapter 10. The Inquest of the Witch. The Warrens knew that to defeat a demonic force, they needed more than tape recorders. They needed historical leverage. Ede and Lorraine embedded themselves in the local town library and the historical archives of the Rhode Island Catholic Diocese, digging through original land grants, coroner reports, and tax documents from the 1800s. They confirmed every detail of the dark folklore surrounding Bathsheba Sherman. Ede uncovered the original legal records from the 1844 infant death inquest. He read the dry, clinical descriptions of the small sewing needle driven into the baby's brain, a crime that screamed of ritualistic sacrifice. "Bathsheba Sherman didn't just die here," Ede explained to Roger during a follow-up meeting in the farmhouse kitchen. "She cursed this land before she died. She swore an oath to Satan that she would never abandon this soil, and she would destroy anyone who tried to take her place as the head of this household." Ede pointed a finger toward Carolyn, who was resting on the sofa, her hands trembling. "Look at the pattern, Roger. Bathsheba doesn't attack you or the girls with the same intensity. She is targeting Carolyn. She views Carolyn as her direct rival. She wants to hollow Carolyn out, destroy her mind, take total control of her physical body, and use Carolyn's own hands to murder her daughters. That is how a demonic entity cements its curse, by forcing the living to commit unspeakable acts of evil. To prove his theory, Ede played a reel-to-reel tape recorded during their first week of isolation in the house. The tape contained a standard interview with Andrea, but in the background, beneath Andrea's young voice, was a low, subterranean electronic distortion. When Ede ran the tape through a high-frequency filter, a voice emerged from the white noise, a raspy, multi-tonal, mechanical growl that sent a shiver down Roger's spine. The voice on the tape said a single, clear phrase, "She is mine, I will drink her." The Warrens brought in a team of assistants, including a skeptical secular professor of psychology, Dr. Paul Palmer, to document the phenomena. The house, however, seemed to grow infuriated by the presence of the investigators. The activity spiked to an all-time high. Heavy brass candlesticks were thrown across the dining room during dinner, striking the walls inches from Lorraine's head. The foul odor of rotting flesh became a permanent, unmoving fixture in the central hallway, so dense that the professor had to run to the front yard to vomit. The entity was no longer playing a psychological game. It was mobilizing for a final, lethal confrontation. Chapter 11: The Night of the Broken Circle. The climax of the horror occurred on a dark, moonless night in the late autumn of 1974. The Warrens, convinced that they could not wait for the slow, bureaucratic machine of the Catholic Church to approve an official rite of exorcism, decided to take a dangerous, independent gamble. They arranged for a high-level séance to be conducted in the farmhouse's central living room, bringing in an ordained, radical minister and a trusted trance medium named Father Alphonsus. The goal was to force the spirit of Bathsheba Sherman to manifest completely within a consecrated spiritual circle, confront her using the authority of the ministry, and command her to break her hold on Carolyn Perron. Roger Perron was deeply skeptical and highly protective, his paternal instincts screaming that this was a mistake. But Carolyn, physically ruined and mentally broken by years of relentless torment, pleaded with him. "Roger, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't live like this anymore. It's taking me. Let them try." With a heavy heart, Roger agreed. The 5 young girls were sent upstairs to their bedrooms, instructed by their father to pull their heavy blankets over their heads, lock their doors, and pray, no matter what sounds echoed from the floorboards below. The remaining adults gathered in the living room. All the windows were covered with thick wool blankets to block out the exterior world. The room was lit only by 4 large white candles placed in the center of the table. Ede Warren started the reel-to-reel recorder, the tape hissing softly in the tense quiet. Carolyn sat between Roger and Lorraine, her eyes staring blankly at the candle flames, her skin cold to the touch. The medium closed his eyes, his breathing slowing as he entered a deep trance state. He began the invocation, his voice echoing through the wood-beamed room. "We call upon the intelligence that occupies this space. We command you, Bathsheba Sherman, by the light of the living God, to show yourself. State your intent in this house." If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment what you thought. Thanks for watching. Good night.